Namaste, welcome to Season 3, Episode 19 of TT Talks. My name is Suhas, and today we have a special guest.
Hi, my name is Shilpa Barnami. I am the coordinator of the Hindi-Urdu language program at Boston University, and I'm a senior lecturer in Hindi there, where I teach language courses and culture courses.
Gotcha. So Dr. Parnami, so kind of tell us your journey of kind of becoming a lecturer and like the different academic process to reach a position like yours.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I grew up in India. I was born in India. I grew up there. I did my all of my schooling, which is in India it's like you go to the same school and then you just stay there from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. So I went to school there. I did my undergrad in India and also a master's in English literature at University of Delhi. And when I was there, I learned about this scholarship called the Fulbright Foreign Language Teaching Assistantship while I was in my MA program in Delhi. And that's when I learned about the scholarship. I applied and I managed to get it, and and that brought me actually to the University of Texas at Austin in 2007. So I was there for a year, basically, working as a Hindi TA. Assisting other language instructors in professors and lecturers and teaching classes and helping them develop the curriculum. So that was sort of my introduction to the world of academia in the United States. And I got to stay there and learn so much and absorb a lot, and that sort of became an inspiration for me to want to come back for higher education. So after I went back from the scholarship, I went back to India and applied for grad school to the United States in College of Education. And in 2010, I got admitted to the grad program in language education at UT Austin again. So I stayed there. I joined the program in 2010. I did another master's in language education, and then went down to do my PhD from there.
Gotcha. So what kind of made you interested in literacy studies and getting into this? Because I know a lot of other people, just like who I'm interacting with at college, they're interested in like STEM fields, like computer science. So how did you kind of realize your interest in literature?
Yeah, thank you for asking me that question. All of my community is also, typical career profiles where people have, done their engineering, gone to MS. So I always joke, there's not one person who I know who's come to the United States to become a teacher from India, and especially a Hindi teacher. So I take a lot of joy in being one of those people. To be honest, I didn't actually want to be a teacher ever, because my mother is a high school teacher. She taught chemistry for 30 plus years, and I didn't want to follow her footsteps, honestly, growing up. So I wasn't too keen to be a teacher, but this Fulbright scholarship sort of changed my perspective and my experience completely. Like I said, before I came to UT and became a TA, I was doing my graduate studies in literature, and I had different plans in terms of my career. I wanted to be a writer, a journalist, typically what people do after a master's in English in India. But this experience of being here for a year and, really working very close with individuals and, college students trying to learn a language, that experience was so unique because it made me think about so many things that I had not considered before in terms of how do people actually learn a language. And, these are things that as a native speaker that I've taken for granted. I never thought of Hindi grammar so systematically until that experience. And I've never seen people struggle to say simple things, mera naam kya hai, main kahan se hu. So that just made me really feel humble and gave me a very deep appreciation for the amount of effort people put in trying to learn something that I've just grown up with. And that sort of was the seed for my inspiration to then study this more systematically and academically and do something to help people.
Gotcha. So kind of while you kind of look back at all like your work and kind of your students, why do you think it's important for students and like the current world to be able to understand a lot of these cultural languages? Why is it important for people to know Hindi, Urdu, why is it important for people to know languages from other regions of the world?
That's a great question. I think it's extremely important that people learn languages because for the simple reason that it makes you look at world very differently. It really pushes you to decenter your perspective. It's not just about going to a foreign country and being able to survive there or order a cup of coffee there or, buy a train ticket there. Because honestly, with the way technology is improving and, with AI and everything that's happening around us, you don't really need perhaps a language for instrumental reasons. Like you don't need to know a foreign language to, like I said, to be able to buy a cup of coffee anymore. But you do need to learn a new language to understand people, to truly connect with them, to really, and to challenge yourself in terms of how you look at the world, and just bring more diversity to your monolingual way of looking at the world.
Gotcha. So, how do you think we could kind of introduce more the language learning curriculums and programs within universities? Because I know Georgia Tech at least used to have a Hindi program, but then they stopped it recently. So how can we kind of reintroduce these programs?
That's a great question, and that's honestly a big part of my job also, and my academic concern and inquiry also, that we need to, ever since I joined this field and even early on, I have learned to appreciate and also engage in a lot of advocacy for our language programs. The term that we typically use in academia and language education for Indian languages and other languages is, maybe you know that already, is less commonly taught languages. So they call it's in itself is so ironic because it's actually not a very less commonly taught language because there are so many speakers of these languages in the world. So they're not really minority languages. But of course, from the perspective of being in the United States, these languages are considered less commonly taught. And, a big part of it, of our jobs in the academia is to advocate for these programs. And, we, just like anything else, there are a lot of factors involved in why a language program comes to being in a particular college and university. It has to do with funding. It has to do with the student interest in these languages. There are a lot of issues. So it's quite a task in some ways, a challenge to see, to kind of push the administration and the stakeholders to make them realize that it's not always about enrollments. It's not always about the numbers. Sometimes these languages have to be supported just so that, we can begin a conversation. Like, for instance, don't compare enrollments or don't close language programs universities because there aren't enough enrollments, and compare them to Romance languages in the United States, right? Who have had generations of research behind them and incredible resources, say a Spanish program or a French program.
Yes.
It's so uneven in the kind of support they receive. So it's, I think to answer your question more directly, I think it's making stakeholders realize that these languages need extra support and they need to be seen and not always be compared based on their outcomes or their numbers and the revenue they're generating.
Gotcha. So kind of in your path of becoming a professor, what are some challenges that you faced in terms of just the education aspect, in terms of the position aspect, becoming a lecturer aspect? So what are some challenges that you faced?
So there are multiple layers that I can choose to answer that in. There are some immediate challenges. Like if I were to just speak as a language instructor, trying to teach a language in a university setting, there are of course some immediate challenges of the language classroom itself. And for teaching a language like Hindi or some of the other South Asian languages, the immediate challenge that you have, that the language structure or your student population is very uneven in terms of their proficiency level. So you end up being in a classroom where you have a student, an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, who's grown up speaking or maybe at least listening to Hindi all their life and perhaps can even have a fluent conversation. but has never learned to read or write.
Mm-hmm.
So someone like that could be in Hindi 1.
Mm-hmm.
And along with that, you could have someone from Korea who just likes Bollywood films and has absolutely no idea about India or absolutely no idea about Hindi or Devanagari.
Yeah.
So having two such diverse students with such diverse learning needs and backgrounds and experiences in the same classroom
Mm-hmm.
is a huge challenge. How do you as an instructor keep such student populations engaged in the language,
Mm-hmm.
motivated to learn, and yet do everything possible to personalize the instruction for them so that they all, each of them can reach their respective goals. So that's a very, very, and that's something that
Mm-hmm.
unites a lot of South Asian language instructors because it's a very real challenge for
Yes.
us. So that's a more immediate classroom challenge. But on top of that, I think just also being in a university setting and especially in a place like BU, which is a great university and has a lot of funding and it's a private school. But unlike some of the more, like say UT, more research-oriented public schools, it doesn't have a very long tradition of South Asian studies.
Mm-hmm.
Like it doesn't have an infrastructure in terms of research or in terms of even a community, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the biggest thing that I miss at BU is having a community of like-minded South Asian scholars. So there are individual, faculty members who teach. There's someone who teaches Indian history, there's someone who teaches Indian literature, but we're not part of a community, like structurally a part of a community because BU doesn't have a South Asia program. So I miss that. I miss that a lot. And that's a big challenge. Sometimes not knowing, sort of you feel like you're an island onto yourself and you don't have your academic, intellectual community.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So do you happen to witness that a lot of your students are native speakers, or do you think a lot of them are people who are just genuinely interested in the language?
It's a combination, I would say, of both.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the heritage students, there's a range of reasons for why people choose languages and why people choose to learn Hindi. You have people who are genuinely interested in the language, sometimes even want to develop like professional fluency
Mm-hmm.
so that they can actually do some work in India. But then you often have students who are very motivated by just wanting to connect with their cultural heritage, and languages becomes a beautiful pathway to do that. And that cultural heritage, of course, is very heterogeneous and depends on how people define it. And it could be, wanting to watch Bollywood films to being able to talk to their grandparents in Hindi. It's a range,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a combination of all of that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So do you think BU is doing a great job in funding and providing a lot of these resources for their students? Or do you think there could kind of be some improvements on like the design or the curriculum?
I think BU is I feel supported at
Mm-hmm.
BU in terms of my immediate colleagues
Mm-hmm.
and the kind of professional development opportunities that
Mm-hmm.
I get. But of course, there's always
Yeah.
more that can be done. But in my current role, I feel very supported, especially by my convener who, Professor Sunil Sharma, who teaches Persian literature and, oversees the South Asian part of things also. We have a good working relationship. So in my immediate circle and also my other colleagues from other languages, I feel they're very friendly and helpful. So I feel very supported.
Mm-hmm.
But in a larger scheme of things, just in terms of advocating, I think more higher up in the administration, people can perhaps do more to even get the word out.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've been at BU for 7 years and it's starting to get much better now. But
Yes.
early on, the biggest challenge I would face is that people wouldn't even know that there was a Hindi Urdu program.
Really?
So just promoting the language program and making sure everyone at BU, like my dream is to make sure everyone at BU knows about the language program and gets an opportunity to maybe do a fun class and then decide
Mm-hmm.
whether they would want to learn Hindi Urdu or not. So give us a chance.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So kind of following along with those questions, a recent trend has been that like the new diaspora of South Asian or first-gen people who are living in the United States, they don't really get a lot of interactions with their heritage and their languages from, other parts of the world. So what are some ways that you think, besides kind of media, which we'll get into in a little bit, are some good ways for them to kind of interact with their culture, kind of learn to embrace it, and kind of, just become more accustomed to their heritage?
So you basically mean like educationally or like generally in life?
It doesn't have to necessarily be education, right? Like, for example, along media, right? A lot of media, like, for example, like South Asian TV shows or South Asian movies, that's a great way to kind of immerse yourself in the culture. But what are some ways that you think, besides kind of those two, or including those two, are some ways for people to can get to know South Asian culture, get to know their heritage?
I think in addition to like consuming the media and such, I think it would be really meaningful for the diaspora to also engage with communities more directly, whether in the United States or preferably in India, and not just oftentimes I've seen people just, and including myself sometimes, we tend to restrict ourselves to what is familiar or to what is just restricted to family, but. So you just go visit your, your uncles and your cousins, and you sort of remain in a bubble and you remain, your sense of reality and your sense of what India is remains very restricted because of the way you engage. So I would urge us, to kind of expand that idea of what India is and what our communities are by visiting and actually talking to people, going beyond your immediate circles and engaging in all sorts of contexts and situations where you can talk to a range of people, try and understand what they are going through or what are their life experiences. So I would say travel is a big thing in addition to consuming media. But even if travel is not an option, I think even in media or even in just consuming products of the culture, I think there should be more diversity in what we consume and how we look at India.
Gotcha. So what is your opinion about like TV shows, like for example, Never Have I Ever, and I'm sure there's other TV shows on Netflix, YouTube. So what is your opinion about representation of those characters on those shows? Because I know there's a lot of opposition, a lot of conflict, because some people mention that a lot of them are just stereotypical. But what is your opinion about that?
Personally, I enjoyed the show a lot. I enjoyed it, and it was fun to. There was a lot of common tropes, and there were a lot of stereotypical ideas. As as is the case with a lot of, I recently started consuming a lot of diaspora literature, especially like the chick lit and rom-com kind of, which is the same genre as Never Have I Ever. So I do notice there is a tendency in those writings also to pander to the Western gaze a little bit. So you over-explain things and you sometimes even over-explain things like chai and stuff. So that tends to annoy me a little bit because it makes me feel like, we don't need to do that anymore. These things can be just for us, and we don't always have to worry so much about the Western gaze. So I would say that there are some elements of that in that show also, but I also appreciate these things for the entertainment value, and maybe even maybe not so bad as a starting point in terms of representation and conversation starters. The fact that there's a show like that out there that can generate a lot of conversation, it itself feels like a good first step. A good beginning, but oftentimes the trouble is that we just end up becoming complacent with the beginning and not go beyond that. But in terms of just a pure entertainment show, if white Americans can have 100,000 rom-coms, then why not us? Why can't we have those stereotypes first represented and then critique them? Why not?
Yes, yeah. So you're kind of saying along the lines of it's better to kind of put it out there, kind of allow people to kind of see it for the first time, and then as it progresses, kind of do more and more, better and better.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So back to like your teaching aspect. So what specific courses do you teach, and like what is the kind of curriculum like regarding like grading, or like how do the levels work within the level? Yeah.
So I teach two tracks in some ways, you could say. I do the language and the culture track. So language is we start with absolute beginners, and we do 2 years of Hindi instruction, and that in terms of proficiency levels starts with beginners and ends with like higher intermediate level, I would say. Sometimes some heritage students, if they have a lot of background, they even end up becoming more advanced. in those 2 years, or sometimes even like 2 courses. So those 2 years, meaning like 4 semesters, and we try in our curriculum, we try to address all skills. So, literacy, speaking, listening, everything. And typically the way our instructional materials are designed, they are typically centered around what we call authentic materials. So we take, things that are meant actually for Hindi speakers and try to break them down and make them accessible to the learner, so that their language that they produce in terms of writing and speaking actually echoes real life language, and it's not just bookish and focused just on grammar. So the approach is to introduce real life language very early on, right from the beginning, and sort of try and find ways to make it accessible, because obviously authentic language is not created in a way that's mindful of proficiency levels. So there's always a gap.
Yeah.
So in terms of the instruction, the goal is to reduce that gap and make the authentic language accessible and usable right from the beginning. So that's the language. And, there are themes and topics, and we try to keep change. I kind of do the curriculum design since I now have a colleague, fortunately, because our program's growing. So I now have a colleague who does lower levels of language classes, but I've sort of been developing the curriculum on my own quite a bit. And that's great, because I then have the flexibility to change a lot of topics and bring in more, contemporary topics into the classroom. So that's wonderful that I can do that, and I have the flexibility to do that. In addition to the language, I also teach culture courses in English. So these are like general humanities courses that people can take. Anybody can take. They don't have to be Hindi speakers or from India. And I've developed 2 courses. One is on English in India. So we use English as a tool to talk about issues of language and identity in India. And another course is a course on Bollywood. So it's called Modern India Through Bollywood. Because it's so popular, and it's also such a wonderful medium to actually critically understand India. Not just take films at face value, but to analyze them to see how they represent India.
Gotcha. So could you kind of elaborate on that Bollywood course? I feel like that's the first time I've ever heard about a course like that, ever.
Okay. Yeah, so actually a few of my colleagues also teach similar courses. I think they're around the US. But there are different ways of approaching the course, because Bollywood itself is so expansive. So the way I approach it, I do a cultural history of modern India starting from 1990s. So we start with DDLJ, which is sort of like at the cusp of India's economic liberalization in 1995. And then we come all the way to, the COVID times and the contemporary times. I mean, I'm teaching the course this semester, and I'm hoping to end with Rocky Aur Rani Ki Prem Kahani, so to kind of do a whole 25-30-year span of India. And so we look at the cultural history, and we look at how different societies have been represented in films. There's a bunch of things we do. Like, we look at Bollywood films as aesthetic texts. So we talk about how Bollywood films are not socially realistic, and you should not evaluate them as realistic texts, because they're not meant to be that. So in that sense, we do a little bit of cinematic theory also, because traditionally, when people study cinema in the West, they always focus on social realism. And in some ways, reading popular culture from India is an anti-movement to that, because you cannot always, in other words, you cannot criticize a Bollywood film, oh, this is not realistic. Of course it's not realistic. Yeah. It's not trying to be realistic. So that's where we do a little bit of like criticism of the Western theory also, but just in terms of cinematic theory. But then we also see, okay, so if you cannot look at Bollywood films as social realism, what are some other ways that you can still critically engage with it? So you can talk about, okay, Bollywood films have song and dance sequences, but why? So let's talk about why. What narrative functions do they serve? Are they only there for commercialization, or can they also do something else? And there's some phenomenal scholarship around that. I mean, I'm very fortunate to have access to some great scholarship around some of these topics, at least. So yeah, it's a great. I really enjoy teaching it, and it's a fairly popular course, so it's been fun.
Gotcha. Okay. some challenges we've kind of faced in kind of engaging our students regarding Telugu and Tamil is having like, for us, we want the students to do their own learning. Like we have all the resources, we have all that, because we don't want to have any pressure of grades or anything like that. So what are some ways that you would recommend to kind of engage people to explore some culture, specifically like South Asian culture, like on their own? How do you think that they can, instead of like kind of going like in a course way, like kind of just be able to embrace a lot more aspects of it?
Yeah. I'm assuming like you're more focused on like community learners, right?
Yes.
Like people. Yeah. And I've had some experience working with community level teachers, and I've been part of programs where we've trained community level teachers for Hindi Urdu. And one of the issues there that I've noticed is that there is less interest. Like if I were to talk about just like young kids wanting to learn Hindi or young kids wanting to learn, say, Tamil and Telugu, one of the biggest issues that I've noticed, at least in the case of Hindi, has been that there is less importance given to like the messaging that kids themselves are receiving at home is sort of impacting their motivation to learn. So in other words, if parents themselves don't place enough value on learning Hindi, learning Hindi is as important as going to a coding class, for instance. If that's not the messaging your child is receiving at home, then there will be less motivation just academically to want. Like you'll internalize those messaging and then you'll not value it enough.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very important thing that we as a community need to understand and do, that our kids need to learn the language not just because they can talk to people in India. That's not the only goal. It's also because these languages are so beautiful. So just learn this because this is a part of who you are, and not just that something that you will do with it. It forms who you are. It's so core to who you are. So there is that kind of messaging. If we can find ways to engage people in that kind of messaging and embrace that kind of messaging, I think it will really make a difference in students just. And that will also reflect in people in higher education when they grow up, that they're not taking Hindi or Tamil just because it's easy and they think they can do it, but they actually appreciate the language.
Gotcha. So for you, right, for students that have taken your courses and kind of gone through the entire program, what are some things that they do post-career, or like what are some other fields that they tend to pursue after going into literature, understanding Hindi and Urdu?
So it's very what our alums do is very symbolic of what our community generally is. So honestly, there aren't that many that want to study literature or area studies. I wish there were. I keep finding opportunities to encourage people to do that. But by and large, most of them are pre-meds and people who are more into STEM or sometimes even economics and business. So of course they all also find the language very useful. If not, even if they are not directly interacting. Especially I've had a couple of med students tell me that just having that on their CV sort of put them, the fact that they knew a language and that they could engage with a Hindi speaking community sort of immediately put them in good standing.
Yes.
So that. But I really wish, if through your podcast I can get this word out. Like, I really wish people would engage more with area studies. And studies and
yes. So do you tend to kind of prioritize more of the conversational aspects of interacting, or do you kind of focus more on the syntax, understanding like the word, the meaning, derivations? So what do you kind of prioritize when you're teaching students?
I ideally would try to keep a combination of everything. But just in terms of priorities, some of our curriculum design and our learning outcomes are also informed by what's happening in the field. So foreign language education as a field in the US has moved very much closer to it is very much, in fact, in a post-communicative language teaching era almost, where the focus is very much on communication. So grammar can come later, but let's focus on getting people to start speaking immediately. So we've sort of gone on the other end of that in some ways as a field. There's so much focus on, can people speak? Can people speak?
Yes.
but I think we are finally also realizing that there has to be a balance between everything. That it's not just fluency, but accuracy also matters. And accuracy does come from more deep engagement with the syntax, with the grammar, or with rewriting things, and actually paying attention to the word roots and all of that. So it's a constant balance.
Gotcha.
So I would like to believe that we don't throw syntax out of the window. We do focus on that.
Gotcha. So kind of as we kind of wrap up and kind of sum up all these different ideas in the podcast, what are some things that you'd like our audience to kind of know, or like something that after listening to you and talking with you that they should understand, or like a moral, let's say, of the podcast?
Well, moral is a very heavy word, but I honestly, I'm just like thrilled that you do something like this. I really appreciate the invitation, and I really enjoy talking about these things. And as you can tell, I can go on and on. I'm just like delighted that. Do you mind if I ask you, like, what is your what kind of students are learning Tamil and Telugu, and what's your structure like? And I would love to learn more about that.
Yeah, of course. So regarding our student ranges, we've had students from 5 all the way to 47. Wow. So for example, it's usually like the younger students, their parents enrolled them in the program, so they're kind of just learning it on the side on the weekends. But then as we tend to go to like our older students, those are usually the ones that have like a specific purpose of learning the language. So like for example, like our 47-year-old student, she wanted to know Telugu to be able to interact with her in-laws who couldn't speak English. So there's a different range of reasons why people want to learn the language. But we kind of tend to prioritize we have the resources, we have the curriculum. We want you to be able to engage on your own pace, and kind of go past just reading and writing, right? We want you to interact with the media. We want you to watch movies, listen to songs, know about the current events. And so regarding like our structure and curriculum, we have everything done on Google Classroom. So we have resources like, for example, like vowels, and then we have a worksheet, consonants worksheet, and then we build bigger and bigger sentences, more like smaller phrases. So at the end of the program, you kind of know basic phrases within Telugu and Tamil, but then kind of improving upon that, making more complex sentences, that really just comes from interacting with the culture. And so we give them a bunch of resources. We do like weekly calls to make sure that they're on track, and if they want to practice or anything like that. So we kind of have all these resources lined up, and we just want people to go at their own pace, because we found that more effective than like making sure everyone is at the same spot and ending up at the same place. Because at the end of the day, everyone has different study methods, everyone learns differently. So we don't want to template force study method on anyone. We want people to be able to grow from that themselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I really appreciate that, and I agree with that. Like, the more you can personalize the learning experience and learning materials for the individual, the more likely they are to stick with it. So, personalization, and we're really entering that era where everyone sort of is hooked to their devices and is sort of in their own world. So why not capitalize on it and make it more relevant for them?
Exactly. And at the end of the day, our world is becoming a lot more diverse. There's a lot more immigration, a lot more emigration. People are moving all over the world. So you're going to be interacting with people who are different from you, who have different backgrounds, different experiences, different heritage. So we just think it's good to be informed about everyone, even if you're not the best and be able to like recite everything and talk in perfect grammar and everything. But just being a little aware, being a little more polite, responsible, courteous is really important.
Yeah, actually that sort of is a good way for me to also end with what, kind of going back to your question about the messaging that I would like to share is, it'll be kind of to your point about the world being more diverse and immigration and, Indian community becoming so important and making their presence felt. It'll truly be heartening to see just people sign up for these languages and value South Asian languages just as much, like for it to become such a matter of norm and normalize it so much, as all the way starting from high school or perhaps even middle school, that when a non-South Asian heritage person enters the school system, for them we can dream about a
Yes.
world where for them taking French is as much of a choice as taking Tamil, Telugu, or Hindi.
Yes.
Like, why not?
Yeah.
I hope we dream of I hope someday that happens.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
schools tend to be a little more Eurocentric when it comes to kind of learning languages. But again, it comes from the place because a lot of these languages curriculums have already been established. And
Right.
that it's hard to kind of compare that, as you said, to languages that are just budding and emerging within the US. So there's always going to be like a slight delay when it comes to being able to
Yeah.
introduce Hindi, Urdu, Telugu, Tamil into like school curriculum. But with the proper resources, I'm sure it's going to grow just as big.
Yeah, that's why I said, why not dream about
Yes,
it, right? Like,
exactly.
we want that. Because that's where it will benefit all of us.
Yes.
Right? Like, we'll have more people invested in research. So many of those things will be more people wanting to enter education and do research to then, because you'll have a much bigger population wanting
Exactly.
to be better.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for discussing all this. It was great to talk to someone that was just as inspired about all this as all of us are. But is there anything else that you'd like to mention or kind of give like an important notice to the audience kind of while we wrap up this podcast?
I mean, I love that you have something like this that exists, and I hope more and more people learn languages and pay more attention to South Asian languages, including our diaspora community, and we sort of learn to value what we have
Yes.
and not take it for granted and actually appreciate the process of learning also. I think that's the other aspect that we didn't touch on as much, is that you have certain presumptions about, this language is going to be hard, and you sometimes don't even try, or you think, but it's not always about getting everything right? Like it's also enjoying the process. And
Yes.
like you were constantly pointing out, my personal research also focuses a lot on the intrinsic link between language and culture, how you really cannot think of one without the other. So with all the kind of cultural engagement that you do, or just learning the language gives you so much access to so much. So even if you're worried about getting the genders wrong or
Yes.
the verb conjugations wrong, there's a lot more that you can enjoy with that. Don't worry too much about that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of joy to be had.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's joy in making mistakes too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Very well said.
Awesome. Well, yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Paranami.